crickets outside. You can feel that cyclone off the coast getting closer. And I'm feeling somewhat pensive, meditative. That's why I had to go and get myself Snufkin to drink. Snufkin is one of the Moomin characters from those delightful books, and he's the great restless traveller who needs community but also needs to be alone. I think many of us are like that, and this lecture 5, FUT101, looking at our inner story and why futures. I kind of sneak up on that. I don't sort of go gun-ho for the why futures bit, but it's led me to be quite thoughtful about why I do futures. What is it that calls me into this space? And it's something to do with this interesting tension between the inner world, my inner world, and the outer world. The way we can navigate some of that, perhaps lay out the landscape. That's what Sahel and Ayatollah would call it, the futures landscape. We lay out this landscape in which being can be both meaningful, can be constructive, can be positive. It's not just hanging on, hanging in there, survive one more day or one more, time at work, or one more whatever it is, one more dinner, one more breakfast, one more argument, or one more hug. Okay, so you can see where I'm going with this in a kind of roundabout way. And I was sitting here thinking, how would I start rather than just leap straight in? And I turned to my right here and I picked up this wonderful book, okay, The Universe in Verse. Oops, my finger's on her name. Maria Popova. She's a wonderful woman. She has this great, is it a Substack? It's something like that, blog, Substack, something. It's called the Marginalian, and which I've subscribed to for a long time. And I even toss a few little bits of money at her through Patreon because I think her work is so brilliant. And she reflects on many writers. She's got one of those incredible brains that's out there and in touch with beauty and meaning, but very interdisciplinary or even transdisciplinary. Here she's talking in this, but it just opened here, talking about dark matter and physics, and a number of her essays in this little book come with that, but each essay is accompanied by a poem. And she's talking about Rebecca Elson. And Rebecca Elson is this glorious poet who was a physicist, an astrophysicist, and she didn't make it to 40 years of age. She died of some horrible form of cancer. But in her last years, she wrote frantically about her inner experiences and this love of the universe that she felt, this incredible flow of universal energy that goes through us all, I think, if we ever breathe into it. I'm hearing that wind outside. I don't know if you can hear it. And so in talking about dark matter and Rebecca Elson's poem, and I'll read it to you. I might as well because I've got that far now. I don't want to torment you. But Popova says this first. Permeating Elson's lyrical meditations on the nature of reality, mortised and tenoned with life and love. The mystery of dark matter culminates in one particular poem exploring with uncommon loveliness what may be the most touching paradox of being human. And this is something to do with this futures stuff and why I'm called to futures, but perhaps I'm called into futures via temporality itself and this paradox of being human, which of course sits behind many of the things that I read and also the way I write, trying to capture that paradox and transmit some of that, what I call futures pheromones, to others. Yeah. So she says this. touching the paradox of being human. Creatures of matter in a cosmos governed by the dark sublime of endless entropy, dark matter. Longing for the light of immortality, longing, I call it yearning, but it's the same thing, to return to the singularity so that everything may begin again. Longing to return to the singularity. It's in my book, I describe that as longing for, as part of the Brahma Chakra, returning to the source of where we came, this kind of cosmic journey we're all on. However you want to describe it. Doesn't matter which faith tradition you are in, or whether you're a die-hard atheist. Hopefully even atheists, I know atheists are fantastic. Actually, very close to me are a number of them. And great souls, great spirit. It's just, they've been bitten probably right savagely by religion. So I can't blame them. There's a savagery in us as well. So I should read you the poem. But just before I do, I think I might mention the fact that in this inner story lecture, that there is something sublime that you can be feeling, opening up to. It's an opening up to lecture in many ways. And it's also describes quite intimately some aspects of my own journey. So it's going to be nice. Slightly vulnerable. I feel vulnerable. Do I feel vulnerable? Yes, I do. Anyway, let there always be light, says Rebecca Elson. For this we go out dark nights. Remember, she was the astrophysicist looking at the stars night after night, weeks, months, years, searching for the dimmest stars, for signs of unseen things, to weigh us down, to stop the universe from rushing on and on into its own beyond, till it exhausts itself and lies down cold, its last star going out. Whatever they turn out to be, let there be swarms of them, enough for immortality, always a star where we can warm ourselves. Let there be enough to bring it back from its own edges, call it back, to bring us all so close we ignite the bright spark of resurrection. What a glorious poem. I'm going to stop and get into the lecture. Seriously, had I not one more sip, a bit of Moomin further. Okay, so lecture 5 opens with this glorious image. I've taken many a photo like this, and I'll talk more about them later, but these are Bronze Age carvings, petroglyphs in rock, to be found in southwestern Sweden, along the Norwegian border, and obviously into Norway as well, across that landscape of incredibly old weathered rocks, because of course it was heavily glacial 10,000 years ago, 8,000 years ago. But about 2,500 years ago, people were there and they were carving all sorts of things. And I've got a few other images to show you. This is the image, as far as anthropologists can make out, of possibly the presence of spirit, a god. The only way you know that they're there is that their footprints are there. I think I wanted to start with that because, as I said, there is something special about contemplating why futures. Let's have a look at why, hey? So I start off with a thought process that I was involved in when I wrote a poem called The CLA of the Gods. I'm not going to read you that poem. You can go and find it if you are curious. It's in my book, but it's also the next big thing, but it's also online at the site where this comes from. And it was actually Sahel and Ayatollah asked me, he said, could I expand on why I wrote the poem, not just toss it in to be looked at by CLA aficionados, but could I explain a little bit about why I was writing it? And I talked about my relationship with Sahel, whom I have known since 1989, and it's been a lovely relationship, very sweet. And I did a CLA of the self, and this is one of the things that I'm going to be asking you to do for yourselves this week. So I'm quoting myself here. Indeed, the personal weaves throughout my relationship with CLA. It has fermented in me, but also fermented me. It illustrates this point, so I illustrate this point, through a CLA of self, in which the individual I is scattered amongst the elements of doings and tastings, that is, listening. I teach, I create in classroom and kitchen. I scatter words of poetry or theory. I play with ideas, but also things. This is my litany. I walk in the forest and touch the trees and vainly try to count the leaves. The individual I of the social world works in communities and universities. But really, this system, me, is a collective we of sticky relationships that sit embedded in human and more than human processes that support me, but also disciplines me. It holds me down in some way. That's partly history, culture, system. My system's eye walks in the forest and hears the sap moving and the microbial work of ages in the soils and mulch. Halfway through the CLA, if you know your CLA, the I described here inhabits a worldview of relationships and story. This is a spiritual, shamanic place of magical encounters and dancing play. It is alive to all we do, and as I fall through the cracks in the floor of being, I enter the place of the rhizome. Here, as the metaphor me wriggles and squirms amongst the detritus of cultures old and new, I continue to ferment until one day I become another fallen leaf on the forest floor. So I have this lovely image of compost here, and I feel, when we share in our relationships our deeper feelings and thoughts about the world we inhabit, we try and communicate that with others. We are breaking down the barriers between us because, of course, those barriers are in actual fact imagined. We are much more collective, much more homogenous, much more culturally wedded and woven, like the rhizome, like the wriggling and squirming soil that we generate through composting. So I am compost. I think that's rather interesting. So as CLA emerged, and this is still quoting me, I found it spoke deeply to me, both as a method and as a taxonomical approach to the world. That's the little article there, CLA as Process 2014. Yet for me, the aesthetic dimension of CLA is quite exceptional. CLA offers an ordering of perception that is deceptively simple. I use perception here as the broad term to cover the way we make sense of the world. This sense-making is always subjective and always alive, fermenting in us. It is not static. So that was my little, you could say, CLA manifesto, because I thoroughly enjoyed writing that poem, CLA of the Gods. It may appear in a later lecture, so don't get overly worried if you can't find it. But now let's move to somebody else who likes CLA. My dear friend Marguerite Westacott wrote this beautiful paper on CLA of self, which incorporated CLA of self. It's not really just on CLA of self, but it's a beautiful paper where she uses CLA images. I'm not sure where to pull myself here with this one. Maybe I should just pull myself, or maybe I should just delete myself. How's that? There we go. Now I don't have to keep juggling myself, do I? So Marguerite has this to say first. So she's a painter, visual artist. She probably wouldn't want to be called a painter. She's much more eclectic than that. She does all sorts of wonderful stuff. But anyway, she creates images, and as part of her reflective process, and I think it's really important to acknowledge that we think very much in images, or maybe we could better phrase it as we feel in images. And some people, like Marguerite, are lucky to give form, perhaps even voice, to images as images. It's another form of language. So she has this to say. Jung's psychoanalytical, that's Carl Gustav Jung, the psychologist. Jung's psychoanalytical perspective posits, that is, the symbols within the artwork, rather than the artwork itself, that arise from the unconscious. From this view, the motifs that arose in Divine Ache, the iceberg in the room, lovely name, of water and boat, lighthouse and iceberg. If you have a close look at water, boat, lighthouse, iceberg, okay, so they're in that image, okay. They have symbolic tendrils of relationship, affect, and identity that, with my parents, with the physical loss of them, and the intersectionality of life transitions. So much going on in one human heart. It's quite amazing. And the ability to transform loss and grief, for instance, it's not that you suppress it, but it transmutes into some kind of wisdom, okay? And so then she turns to causal layered analysis itself. So she offers us a causal layered analysis of self, an extended version of the sort of thing that I was doing before. The causal layered analysis has been used as an analytical tool to contemplate the emergent information from the art making and artwork in order to reveal an alternative and preferred new life story. Rather than just getting old and cranky, it's about becoming an elder. So here she takes one detail from the entire work. So I'll flick back for a moment. There's the entire work. So she grabs a bit. World is changing. That's the deconstructive. Faster than ever. Okay, this is the litany. You can't keep up. So this is the kind of stuff that weighs you down. Whereas the reconstructed litany becomes a concept of elderhood. Elders are trailblazers, as guides, purpose and meaning has, okay? And they adapt to the natural order of things and so on. She quotes Tyson Yunker Porter's beautiful book on sand talk and so on. Then she moves to having a look at the system level. Identity of a daughter is gone. She's no longer a daughter. Why? Because her parents are not with her. What are the rules now? Invisible, separation from the natural world. But reconstruct the story at systems level. Freedom from perceived identity roles. Pursue passions. Use workplace to follow interests. Not be bound by workplace and to have to be the good girl. Okay? And I'm sure all of us are familiar with being good girls or good boys, or trying to be. Often failing and feeling miserable, inadequate, and all the rest. All right, so let's move to worldview, how we map our mind, foundational myths. Cultural narratives impact on identity, such as external appearance, age, gender, identity, aesthetic is influenced by culture, and so on. So her work, this piece, and her PhD is focused on curere. That means the career. What does it mean? Curere. Learn from that which forms who I am. Trust in the anticipatory aesthetic. Great term. I love that term. Trust in the spiritual path. Be explicit. Own your space. Don't be afraid to speak your truth. Okay. So it's beautiful. And then we get down to the very depths. I was forgetting to say, look, here we go. There's detail. I'm skimming along, so excited. But yes, the visuals that accompany this, the identity of the daughter, the freedom to conceive,
Then going deeper in here, see what's this down here, over here. There's the ship, or the sail of the ship, or it's the prow. This is the front of the ship, or the little boat sailing. So, tossed around on the sea, not anchored, not grounded. These are metaphors, I think, that many of us would associate with. And of course, I bring this up in a sense later on in one of the things that I offer you. So the reconstruction is we're in a state of flux, synthesizing change, embody all selves and ancestors represented by the iceberg, ancestors of the future. So being an elder, litany now becomes being an ancestor of the future. What a privilege to be an ancestor of the future. So, thank you, Marguerite. What happened here? Something terrible's happened. I better go and investigate for a second. Problem solved at all. I mean, it was no problem at all. Problem solved because it was no problem. It is my CLA from the previous lecture. In this one, I'd like you to work through it and do a CLA of yourself, just as you've seen Marguerite and I doing. You can stop and start, pause, but you've also got the PowerPoint as well. So, you know, you've got all you need to play with CLA, okay? So, allow yourself time. I remember when I asked Marguerite to make that CLA of self, at first she was kind of dismayed, but it opened up for her as she dived in. And, you know, when we grab her in our next tutorial or something, we can see if she's prepared to talk a little bit about that journey. Because currently, of course, I'm doing what many people do for other people. We're glossing. I'm glossing. But the true inner story was Marguerite's to tell. And there is something really intimate about futures. You can't escape the fact that it's very, very personal. And that's why I said, you know, come at this from your own truth. I'm quite happy to say, hey, I meditate. I've had a spiritual path for decades and decades, you know. That's not the problem. It just helps me think in a certain way that is open to possibility and so on. So I actually see it as a strength. Shall I keep moving? I think so. All right. So today, earlier on today, I was talking about this wonderful man, Ashish Nandi, who's as old as my mum, actually. I realised a few days ago when I had a look at his, his bio and everything. Still with us, still doing quite well, I believe. I had the honour of him examining my PhD, which he liked. I was very lucky. He didn't say any mean things, actually, other than the fact that I should have said more. And because I was using this intercivilizational stuff that, you know, that I'm very focused on, because to me intercivilizational work is a way of thinking creatively between spaces, and I'm going to talk more about that in a moment. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on Nandi, other than to say that, you know, he really did ground my own thinking in a kind of inner-outer psychological, you could say, way of understanding culture. So I see culture as system, I see culture as historical, and that means that I have a strong sociological kind of bent in my own thinking. But the psychological, especially, let's say, like Marguerite refers to Jung, the psychological is deeply involved in understanding how and why people do what they do as collectivities and so on. So there's the psychological, and Nandi is very interested in the role of the past in the present and as it informs the future. So he's also interested in what he calls critical traditionalism. And I would link that very closely with my own thoughts about creative traditionalism, in which, I've said it many times in many different contexts, we cherry pick our past for the best. Culture is a mess. It's filled with the worst of us as well as the best of us, you know. So we've got Auschwitz and we've got the Taj Mahal, or, you know, Chartres Cathedral, or whatever it might be. We've got the glories, but we have horrors. And, you know, that's part of that paradox of being human. For me, though, and this is where I'm going to jump to the next slide, Nandi talks about the shamanic and the role of the shaman in futures thinking, and that's really important. I'm going to quote him momentarily, but I'm taking his... Sal and Ayatollah wrote that great paper, The Six Pillars of Future Studies, and which was published in 2008. When I read it, I immediately thought to myself, hey, there are 6 shamanic principles that I am drawing on constantly, and they crystallized for me in response, actually, to his paper, which shows you how people do think and grow from interactions or intersections, as Marguerite said, intersectionality there. So for me, you need an easy focus. That's why this image is out of focus. Concepts like geophilosophy from Deleuze and Guattari, as is the rhizome. Intercivilizational dialogue, that's more like Fred Dalmer, who is an American sociologist. Heterotopia, the multiple topoi, which is the multiple landscapes, the multiple layers of things that are on top of one another. That's from good old Michel Foucault. Immanence, back to Deleuze and Guattari, and I talked about immanence last week. And hybridity, that means when things encounter one another, they contaminate one another. That's the viral, you might say. So these are my 6 shamanic principles, and I'm constantly drawing on them for meaning making, sense making in the world, and the way that I use literature, poetry, visual stuff, body movement, dance, everything. So one example, Nandi is deploying what I would call geophilosophy, and my sense of it from Deleuze and Guattari is that all civilizations produce explicit or implicit philosophical ways of making sense of, determining reality, meaning, identity. We need to break out of our own civilizational temporal cages. That's my assertion. From the paper that I produced, I came up with 6 boxes, and this one's the one for geophilosophy, knowing grounded in geopolitical grid. Okay, so it's grounded in that grid. All knowledge is invested in its own history and references meaning against its history. So all knowledge is self-referential. And Nandi makes that point very clear in that book that I was looking at this afternoon, Tradition, Tyranny and Utopias, where he's looking at the utopian bubble, you might call it. So this futures thinking asks, and each time I ask a question, what is the civilizational commitment of this line of thought? How might geofutures become biofutures? That means planetary integrated life futures. That was me in 2009. And I'm flagging that because, as Nandi says here, the shaman is important. And I see good futures as playing the role of a shaman for their community, whether it's a contractual arrangement with an institution or whatever, or whether you're doing it with friends, or like me, just sharing stuff with you guys through the futures course. So Nandi says, and I've quoted this, I don't know, 3 or 4 times in different papers, the shaman has 1 foot in the familiar, 1 foot outside, 1 foot in the present, 1 in the future, or as some would put it, 1 foot in the timeless. So I think he's hedging his bets there a little bit, but he's really giving us a sense that the shaman is an in-between figure, a figure that bridges different temporal consciousness spaces and so on. I chose this image again from Tarnum, which is where the feet come from in my introductory image. These are, again, an anthropological interpretation, 2 women helping the sun rise. That's the sun. Their role as would-be shaman is to enable the continuities of the sun rising on every day. And because, of course, this is in the north where they have an almost total the total dark of winter and so on. The rising of the sun and the setting of the sun are deeply significant for these people. So as shaman, we have this here. I love this so much. I have it tattooed on my back. True, I do. Because it says something so important to me about the role of spirit in the world. I'll leave it at that. So, last meditation on the shamanic is one of my other poems. It's from a lovely little book called Carry Your Little Flute, which I co-edited with Meera Chakravarti, a wonderful Indian poet and philosopher academic. So I say here, looking at those feet, and these are male figures here below the feet, and again, anthropologists have posited that they are shaman doing a dance, a ritual dance. But I have this to say, when I stand there amongst those geoglyphs, and I've done this many times, I just get overwhelmed. And one time I scribbled down this poem. The gods were here. That's the footprints, right? A host of them, and they demanded ritual. A reverence we today scarcely understand. We who have lost the sacred to the banal. Yet here, under a moody sky, a little of that ancient magic touches me, silvering my skin. Those footprints drive it home. The gods are here still. They never left, waiting patiently for us to return and participate in strange rituals, taking selfies, striking heroic poses, oohing and ahhing, restless and distracted for the most part. Can we dance to that ancient rhythm, join those crouched men, masked and intent? I think we can. And it's up to us to work out how. Ritual for me is very, very important. And we will be touching more on that in a later lecture, because a number of the people who we've interviewed actually, we have a paper coming out, a chapter actually on ritual and responsibility and so on as a futures tool. So more on that later. Aha! Okay, so that was Thinking Deep time. Here's one of my favourite people. I talked about her in the week 3 reading. Elise Boulding. All right, no, week 4 reading. It was week 4. Elise died a few years ago, lived to a great old age. She was a Quaker, a sociologist, one of the key figures in forming what we would now call peace studies and so on. She gave us this idea of the 200-year present. So Nandi talks about utopias and isomorphism. That means that there's an internal world that's reflected in the external world, but they come from different spaces. Boulding gives us slow time and becoming people. These are concepts that she offers us. This slow time, of course, Nandi picks up on as well. And beneath it all, there is this yearning to be connected. And yearning for me is something that is really important. Marguerite Westacott, in that paper that I was citing earlier, says that the whole point of that paper was to reflect on her yearning. What is it that we yearn for, she might ask. Okay, so here we have yearning, Elise Boulding. Now I want you to consider this. This is from, and I didn't actually, reference it. It's from Richard Slaughter in my book on Futures Thinking for Social Foresight. And it's 200-year present. It's one way of depicting it as interlinking change. Grandparents, parents, self, children, grandchildren. Okay? Between 1900 and the year 2100. I would like you to take that and to fill it in with people that you've known. They don't have to be grandparents. And it doesn't have to be that time scale. It would be 2025. And you would go back to the year 2000 when you may have been born, or you were first having children. You maybe have been born in 1975. Go back from 1975 to 1950. Go back from 1950 to 1925. That's a century ago. Do you know anybody who was alive then? You may not know them now because they may have died, but you are very likely to have connections that far back. And then, of course, you can imagine, depending on your age, where you fit, going up a century into the future. Maybe you're my age, in your late 60s, and you know that, let's say I played with my granddaughter today, beautiful little Amy, and, she's not even 1 yet. So I may hold her, and, I might be dead tomorrow, drop off me perch, but she will have been held by somebody who was alive in the late 1950s. Okay, so these connections, this is a way of thinking, but it's a semi-localized time. If I go back here, Balding's talking about slow time and becoming people. This time scale that she's got here allows us to situate ourselves in what I would call a local present of 2 centuries. 2 centuries from a historical perspective, nothing much. Evolution, even less. Okay, but it's a really useful way to stretch our imaginations, as I say here, our anticipatory imaginations, to get unstuck. We are stuck, and we need to get unstuck from our own temporal parochialism is a good word. And parochial, for those of you who don't speak English as your first language, means the local. Your self-obsession is your own family, your own community, your own tribe, basically. So what's happening? Getting unstuck. So the next section of this lecture is about really imagination activism and where it takes us. Okay, so we live in the between. This is the shaman space. The best futures work is done with an awareness that we are working between realities. Futurists work between structure and post-structure, self and other, past and future, fear and hope. We navigate that between space because that's the creative space of emergence. Let's play a game. Avatar. Pretty cool movie. I like number 1. I haven't really watched number 2. It's on my to-do list. My guess is it's probably not as good as number 1. The second movies rarely are. So I want to do a creative CLA. I want you to find a movie, think about one that you like or dislike, and apply a CLA to it. I'm going to do that with Avatar here. So bear with me. This is going to flick through this quite quickly. So here we are. Foresight in context. Number 1. This is listening. This bloke, one of the first things he says to the new recruits, everything out there in that jungle wants to eat you. Everything is out to get you. You have to be ready and armed, and the only thing to do is to be able to smash that which is going to smash you. It's a dog-eat-dog world out there. That's good. Miles Porridge, okay? Comes to a gruesome end at the end. But what about the strategic? Foresight in context. Parker Selfridge, what a cool name, okay? Parker Selfridge. So he's the systems guy. He's the guy that's working for the company, and he has to make the tough decisions, and he's being strategic. Of course, he gets out-strategized because the planet itself wallops him. But that's his role. So there's foresight in context number 2. It has to be strategic. What about number 3? The vision. This is the world view. Grace, Augustine, these names just get better and better. Grace, the gift of grace. Augustine, he was the Christian saint that formalized the city of God. I'm sure that those names are not accidents, okay? But Grace gives us vision, right? She has the vision. She's doing the genetic work. She's working with the people on the planet and so on. She's got the vision, but she's missing something, isn't she? She's missing the ability to deeply touch metaphor, and that's where good old Jake Scully comes from, okay? Or comes in, should I say. He's involved in what I would call participatory leadership, but this is the myth-metaphor level. And I'm going to unpack this myth metaphor level a bit. So Jake finds himself, his warrior spirit links with his ability to go native, you might say, to that indigenous worldview, and his ability to see beneath the surface of things. So how do we map this? Well, in a future sense, we've got this the double matrix again. We have the jungle out there, that's the physical stuff. We have strategy, that's the system stuff, the company that pays for all the the science that goes into making these avatars. We have Grace with her vision, and we have the participatory leadership. Anticipatory imagination and its strategic focus have to incorporate all four for it to work and to feel real to whoever we're working with. So there we've got it. This is me now making it into a kind of visual capture where we have the micro. That's Jake and his relationships with the immediate people around him. There's the meso. That's the work on the planetary level, perhaps. And then the macro is that struggle over meaning, dignity, value, and the worldviews, the tensions between exploitation and what would we call co-creation. So we're working across and between these domains. So what happens then? So here he is. That's that moment when Jake, he's just had his ass whipped. He's been thrown out. Everybody in the tribe thinks he's an asshole. Strategy and story. What happens? He goes and he captures one of these guys. Strategy without a story will not gain any traction. So he has to do something. And as he says something like he has to take it all to a new level, right? He's heard the story of the Torok Makto, okay, and while changing the parameters within which the story is understood. So he changes the story by actually picking up on deep stories of the people on the planet and leveraging them to prove that there is a way forward beyond grief and loss. So that's really interesting. So that's me CLAing a movie. You have a go. I'm looking forward to hearing what you come up with. I'm already asked you to do 3 things, haven't I, so far? But you don't have to own up to the, what do we call it, the CLA of self, unless you want to. We might find some space there. I'm interested in how you go with it, not with what you come up with. There's the 200-year present, okay, which I think would be really fun to play with for you. And also this one, take a movie, or it could be a novel for that matter, and do what I just did. Okay, so what's happening here? Well, as we're working across those domains, we're pushing boundaries of consciousness. Futures thinking involves the use of new intellectual paradigms, okay, to disturb our habit. So over here, this is an interesting little clip that I got from somewhere, and I have actually no idea now because I've been using it for years. We have uncertainties and we have decision stakes, okay, or stakeholders. So if you want to work at low level impact on thinking and consciousness, you stay with applied science. Oh, I've got a problem here. We need an engineer. Sea level rise, we need to build dikes to stop the, Caloundra and Mooloolaba and all those towns along the coast here on the Sunshine Coast in Australia from going under. So it's a techno fix. We have at the systems level, as we're starting to expand, and systems stuff has been going on, I don't know, since the 1950s, maybe even a bit earlier. And this is where professional consultants go out and they make big bucks often, helping people working at the coalface in industry or whatever it might be, to rethink the relational networks that they're in, to understand them as systems in which multiple operating factors or drivers, as you would call them in the systems analysis, will shape and reshape the world around you, and how do you respond to that as a decision maker. But what happens if you go out to the post-normal science space? This is Jeremy Revetz and that sort of stuff, but it also picks up on Zion Sada's post-normal times, which I know some of you have become quite interested in, quite rightly, because it's a rich area to play in. Well, out here, you can have high impact by challenging, pushing the boundaries, as I'd say, using new philosophical, intellectual concepts to push the boundaries of consciousness. So that's just a little segue there. So we have, what are the things stirring the pot? Quantum physics, uncertainty, the implicate order. We have systems dynamics. We have systems thinking itself. We have post-normal science. Okay, so let's keep moving, because I want to now move on to a bit more of the personal stuff. The acid test is working with people. Wherever you are as a futurist, you can't be sitting in some little, cave meditating on the future and coming up with futures plans and never talking to anybody. You've got to test it. You've got to work with people. These images here are photographs that I've taken or have been taken of me. These two photographs come from Tamkang University. At different times, we've got young students working there, and below we've got the staff, you could say. So no matter what level of engagement, top governments and corporations or grassroots communities, foresight requires people to work together to create a space in which thinking can emerge. Just think participatory leadership, as in Jake Scully in the movie Avatar. So then we start with, what's our emotional anchor, the feeling of the deep future within? This is often unconscious. Is our image of the future, our feeling of the future, that we're playing dice with the gods? Or is the future or time itself flowing and we're going down this big river, the Mississippi or whatever it might be, and the future just keeps unfolding? Or maybe the future is an endless sea. Or maybe it's a roller coaster ride. We're on a roller coaster ride and it feels like it's getting faster and faster and faster and faster. We're going to fly off. Okay? These are potential images. So what can we say about images of the future? Fred Pollack wrote that book, The Image of the Future. I don't have a hard copy. I've only got the PDF. But it's one of those books I'm going to touch on anyway. What are our images of the future? How do we even start mining that? So this might be a starting point where you can say to people that you're going to work with, here are some images of the future. What are yours? And I'll think, what are mine? I have no idea. So let's keep moving then. We can identify things by playing with the future's collage. It's something I do very often. We can identify contradictions. We can allow the pasts into the room. All those stories, often disowned stories, stories of trauma, but also stories of great success. Maybe 10 years ago, your community or your business hit an all-time high in all ways, and the staff were on a roll, but now everything's feeling stifling and stuck. You need to get unstuck. Or what are the realities, plausibility and possibilities? So here we are, futures collage, different ways of working with people. Okay, so this was in Sweden. Here we are. This one was in Holland, working with teachers. Okay, yeah, that's me. A bit younger. I even have some colour in my hair. This is me with Tamkang University students when they were doing some futures work. And this is the futures collage stuff that they were building at the time. Here they are talking about it, taking paper stuff and linking it up with this very clever little screen that was being projected on. You can actually see they're using I hadn't thought of that before, using the image that I gave you before. So there's the jungle and there's participatory leadership, and down there's system, and here's culture or whatever I called it. Okay, but there's also time for space to reflect, time to just go. This is looking at the 10th floor at Tamkang University. Here we are. This one's in Sweden, working with a group of people in Sweden, where collaboration, where they were working on a collective task. That would be our best way of putting it, a collective task to come up with elements of the future, and they're all working together. They're telling stories as they go. And some of these people will be people I'll be working with in May again. Orsa here, for instance, is one of the key organisers. It's Michael there. This is Dada there, and yeah, really nice. And almost the last slide. Here we have young people doing the same sort of thing but working in parallel. These are kids. Tamkang. Yeah, I just had to go for a moment. It's either the Philippines or Tamkang, but I'm pretty sure it's Tamkang. So, last slide. Why futures for me? Well, futures allow us to dream. It allows us to experiment, reimagine our possibilities in a world that seeks to control through the power to define us. The practice of futures provides us with the concepts and tools to be effective, imagination activists, to be effective imagination activists, which I think is absolutely key. How do we kickstart people's imaginations? Because that's where optimism arises from, their sense of agency increases and so on. And lastly, by challenging given assumptions, life opens up and becomes absolutely remarkable. That's why I chose this kind of image. Life opens up and becomes remarkable. So I hope that this kind of personal lecture in some ways gives you some further insight, but also triggers you to think about why futures. Why futures for you? Okay, so I'll be chasing you up on those three little tasks: the CLA of self, the 200-year present, and the CLA of a movie or a book, story, novel like that. And I look forward to seeing what you all come up with. No, it's not that one. Come up with, when I catch up with you in person, either on Tuesday or on Saturday. Adios. Bye-bye. Hej då.